Hello and welcome to The Wire. My name is Indra Shekhar Singh, and today we will be talking about the recently concluded COP28, where the nations of the world have met and decided the future trajectory of not only humanity, but perhaps our planet. And talking to us about this very important meeting and event will be Shyam Saran, who's also a former secretary and also the PM Special Envoy on climate change. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And to begin with, Saranji, we want to know, how do you look at the COP28? What were the main agendas, and how do you see all the events that took place there?
First of all, this COP28 was important for two reasons. One is that it is the first global stocktake that was mandated by the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. That report was presented at this COP28. And it really sort of focused on what was required in terms of science for reaching the average global temperature rise of only 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050, and what the level of effort so far had been in terms of the various commitments for emission reductions or for mitigation that states parties to the convention had put forward so far. And in addition to that global stocktake, it also operationalized something which had been a very long-standing demand from developing countries, that many of them are actually suffering from what may now be called as irreversible damage due to climate change. Irreversible in the sense that there is no known way of reversing some of the damage that they have incurred as a result of global warming. So that is what led to the proposal for a loss and damage fund. And finally, after considerable resistance from the developed countries, the loss and damage fund was operationalized at this particular COP28. So these were two major decisions which were on the agenda. And, in terms of these two agenda items, of course, we have the declaration, which gives you a picture of where we are and how far we still have to go.
Sure. So also there were some very important things, and in your article you mentioned that some of the conclusions there were quite actually depressing, if I was to say verbatim. So why do you say that? And then of course the next question would be, which is kind of linked to this one, is if you look at the voluntary programs of countries and the kind of effect they will have on reducing the temperature or reaching the intended temperature, it's only marginal or fractional. Like, in no way do the national programs conform to getting temperature down below 2 degrees or 1.2, 1.5 degrees. It seems to us like it's a big a show. How would you say that?
So, you have in a sense answered your own question, because we are really very, very far away from anywhere near the effort required in order to even get to 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. Forget about 1.5 degrees centigrade. In a recent article that I have written for the Indian Express, I have pointed out that, science says that we should actually by 2030, we should have reduced, emissions by over 30%. I think it is about 36% or more than that, and by 60% by 2035. What has been achieved so far? Not achieved so far, but what will be the achievement by 2030 if all the various nationally determined commitments are actually delivered on, which itself is a bit of a question mark, then we will have reduced emissions only by something like 2% or so by 2030. So look at the gap that we have. And 2030 is not very far away, is it? Mm-hmm. Also, the science says that in addition to this, actually the global emissions should peak. That is, they must now reach a kind of a ceiling by 2025. 2025 is only 2 years from now. So where is the question of global emissions peaking in the next 2 years? So this is the reason why I have said that the global stocktake gives you a picture of where we need to be, where we are at the moment, and what is the scale of the shortfall that we are confronting. So the reason why it is a depressing situation is that there does not seem to be any likelihood in the very short time frame that we have available that we will actually be able to marshal the kind of effort which is required in order to be anywhere near, as I said, even 2 degrees centigrade, let alone 1.5 degrees.
And I think this gets me to my next point, which is if you look at the funding of who are the big people involved in the climate negotiations, and of course there are many things behind the curtain which you know better than most of us. There are power groups, there are influences, there are international lobbies that are working for certain policy guidelines. Now, when the COP is happening, majorly supported by people like Bill Gates, there is the whole fossil fuel countries, the Saudis, the Middle East. How can you ensure that their agenda is not kind of co-opted by the national interest or by the international agenda? In no way do we see a recession even in the fossil fuel economy. Some of the biggest funders actually come from the fossil fuel industry. Some of the biggest corporations are profiting from the fossil fuel industry. How can we expect everybody to reset by in the next 2 years' time?
So there are two issues that you have raised. One is the issue of funding. Now, as far as funding is concerned, again, I have pointed out that as far back as 2009, that is when we had the Copenhagen summit, at that time, there was a commitment made by the developed countries that they would provide $100 billion in climate finance to developing countries annually. So this is from 2009 onwards. Okay. Then in 2015, yes, regret was expressed that so far from 2019 to 2015, they were nowhere near $100 billion. It was just a small fraction of that $100 billion. But now they will make sure that by 2020, this would be delivered on. And according to the global stocktake, they would also start negotiations in 2024 for what would be required in the next period, but with $100 billion as the base. That is, it cannot be below $100 billion. Now, two issues are there. One is that even after 2015, which was the Paris Climate Agreement, not one single year has the $100 billion in fact been achieved. Okay, that is one issue. Second issue is that in counting what is climate finance, what the developed countries have done is that they have put into that particular category things which should not actually be counted as climate finance, like, for example, private capital flows, or, for example, philanthropic flows. I know money that has been given in charity. In many cases, we find that they have recategorized what is official development assistance as climate finance. So the definition of what is climate finance itself has been made very vague and amorphous. This is what was pointed out by our own Minister for Environment and Climate Change at the conference. He said there is no common definition of climate finance. So one, there has been a huge shortfall. And secondly, we still do not have a agreed definition of what would constitute climate finance. Now, my point also is that if we are looking for a much larger flow in the subsequent years, the record that we have so far does not give us any confidence that actually, those kind of monies will be made available. And the other aspect is that the kind of monies that are required, according to science, for coming anywhere near the targets which we have set, run into trillions of dollars. So if we are looking at even the developing countries being able to deliver on what they have put forward as their NDCs, their nationally determined, commitments, then something like $800 billion per year is required over the next 7 years or so for reaching those targets. Now, where is $800 billion going to come from? Now, this I'm talking only about mitigation. If you are looking at adaptation, that is another big story. There you require something like, $300 billion plus per year.
But sir, wouldn't that be a better strategy, given the fact that this system appears to be broken? There is the actual accords are not being followed. The developing countries are in a lurch because much of our populations are underprivileged. We need the electricity, we need the cheap electricity, we need the cheap transportation. Whereas the developed nations have already exhausted their natural resources and still eating up more. Why should we not go for a national adaptation program irrespective of this treaty?
So whatever I have said
Mhm.
does not mean that therefore we will assert our right to spew as much carbon as we want into the atmosphere because that is required for our development. That is not my point.
Mhm.
I have always argued that for a country like India, both the challenge of energy security as well as the challenge of climate change together require that India should make an accelerated transition from its current reliance on fossil fuels to a pattern of growth which is based more on renewable energy and cleaner sources of energy, such as nuclear energy.
Mhm.
This is something that we have said, for example, in the National Action Plan on Climate Change, as far back as 2008, when we presented the plan. So I'm not suggesting that, there is somehow an argument for a large developing country like India to therefore, say that we will continue to rely on fossil fuels. It has nothing to do with the international negotiations. This is something which we have to do in any case. But it should be recognized that our ability to make that transition in a faster space is also dependent upon how supportive, how congenial the global, environment is. The global environment is not supportive of India's, quest to deal with energy poverty as well as to deal with climate change.
So absolutely, and I think that actually goes against our national interest and our trying to develop and get out of this kind of situation that we are in, especially economically and also ecologically, given the fact that India is one of the most vulnerable nations to climate change.
Well,
So we need a stronger outlook for adaptation. And in case the West and the COP meetings cannot assure us that, which they have failed over the years, there is a need for, like you said, a cleaner energy source, which is coming from maybe bilateral agreements. Would you agree with that? Or multilateral agreements with countries who want to help us achieve that goal? Or should we still stick to the COP28 negotiations?
So I would not like to suggest that, somehow these two things are contrary to one another.
Mhm.
Both the international, effort is necessary. Why? Because climate change is a global challenge, which means what? It means that even say by some miracle, you are able to reduce India's emissions, which is about 7% of the global total.
Mhm.
Even if you make it zero, will climate change stop?
No.
It will not. Because unless all the others join you in an effort to reduce and eliminate emissions, climate change will continue. Okay. So both aspects are important. In parallel, we must press for a much more ambitious climate change agreement globally, as well as focus our attention even more than before on this transition that I spoke about. So the good news is that, for example, we have very ambitious renewable energy targets. The good news is that at least in the nuclear energy field, we have considerable, domestic capabilities. technological capabilities.
Mhm.
And also thanks to the nuclear deal that we were able to negotiate, in 2008, we have today access to the international market, both for nuclear fuel, of which we have very limited supplies, as well as new technologies which allow for much larger capacity nuclear power plants. So there is an advantage in that respect. So it is good that this particular COP28
Mhm.
as number one for the first time accepted that the transition that I spoke about in 2008, we had the National Action Plan on Climate Change, that the only way we can deal with climate change is to transition away from our current reliance on fossil fuels to what will be a pattern of growth based essentially on renewable and clean sources of energy. So this is very important that the COP28 for the first time has recognized the need for that transition. Okay, so that is important. Second is that there are some good targets, like for example, that renewable energy, should be tripled in capacity by 2030. It has also been agreed that something which is perhaps underappreciated is the importance of energy efficiency. That energy efficiency, which is currently, improving at the rate of 2% or so per annum, should be doubled to 4% per annum. And that will make a big difference also in terms of our mitigation efforts. And thirdly, for the first time again, nuclear energy has been recognized as one of the indispensable elements of any response to climate change. So, in those terms, these are quite aligned to our own approach. Because we have, as you know, we have focused a great deal on improving our renewable energy targets. We are very much focused on nuclear energy. And even in energy efficiency, we actually have a very good record. One of the national missions in the National Action Plan on Climate Change was enhancing energy efficiency.
Mhm.
So many of the things actually we have already been doing are now actually being adopted in the global agenda. So in that sense, we have become somewhat more aligned in terms of how to tackle climate change. But I repeat that action has to be both on the global front as well as on the domestic front.
And my last question is, of course, given the geopolitical understandings and movements around the world, there may be a new president in America very soon, one that who has already backed out of the climate agreements. If there's a repeat of such an event, would the COP then just be a paper tiger? And how effective can we expect the COP to be in the coming years, especially in keeping in mind countries like India?
So there is no alternative to the COP process. I mean, I think that should be clear. Even if there is no United States in the COP, process, the United States today represents maybe 10% or 12% of global emissions. There is
And also a lot of finances, not a lot of the economy, the economic drive that the US brings to any
yes,
agreement.
but and in that respect, whatever is profitable to American industry, whatever is going to bring them better returns, irrespective of whether or not the United States of America is part of the COP process or not part of the COP process, this will, in any case, be continue to be relevant. You have seen, for example, even during the Trump years, some of the most ambitious climate action was taken by the state of California.
Mhm.
So, and there are, large American multinationals like, for example, Microsoft. You mentioned Gates, who also have, to a large extent, contributed to keeping the focus on climate change. So, I think even though that would be a big setback to our effort to deal with climate change, because the United States of America, after all, is the most important country, both in terms of its size of its economy, but also its technological capabilities. So it will be a setback. But I don't think that that should really lead us to, a kind of a dejection that we need to now give up this process. This process will continue to be very, very important.
No, sir. Thank you so much, sir. And we really hope that, the world leaders are listening and they actually do what they intend to do. They transfer the money, the technology that's required by the third worlds and the developing worlds to leapfrog, do the green leapfrog. But I think people from the colonized worlds know this, that sometimes promises are made empty. But we do hope that there is some consensus on climate change and the world is a better place. So thank you for watching this show and thank you for being on it, sir. And viewers, this show is over, but The Wire will bring you more shows on climate, agriculture, politics, and a lot of other issues. So do keep watching. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.